Sila. It's a pleasure to have you on LLAG Radio. You are an incredibly gifted artist of many disciplines, from music to writing to filmmaking. Can you tell our audience about the nature of your work and the catalyst that led you to these different passions?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for having me, first off. Uh, Basically, I grew up in a really artistic family. So I was raised in a family of musicians. My dad's an immigrant from the Philippines, and he has like 11 siblings, or he did. And so they were like the Von Trapp family of the Philippines.
Hmm.
So when they came to the US, it was like music all the time. And my mom, she grew up in like she's an Afro-Cuban from Brooklyn. So she grew up in like the heyday of jazz. So all of her friends are like jazz greats.
Wow.
And so my house was just like music and art all the time. And so I grew up as a violinist, a classical violinist. And I had a very like whiplashy moment by the time I was like 17. I'd been playing professionally, and I realized I was never going to be great. Like I was never going to be just legendary. I was never going to be remembered. I was going to like marry some dude in grad school and have some violin playing babies. And like I was going to teach, and that was it. And I was like, I'm 17. I don't want to know what the rest of my life looks like.
Hmm.
And so one of my friends, I went to a performing arts school in LA, and I didn't have a lot of friends outside of music. But one of them was like, hey, so like you wrote a book for fun last year. So
Hmm.
like maybe you're a writer. And I was like, shut the fuck up. That's not a job. And then I Googled it, and I was like, oh my God, people get paid to write stuff? That's insane. I'll go to college for that. And so I was like, yeah, I'll go to college for creative writing because I was a big reader.
Hmm.
And then it was like, oh wait, that's not that's not like a respect. Google was telling me all this. I couldn't ask my
Hmm.
parents because they didn't know I didn't want to be in music, and I didn't have friends who knew anything.
Hmm.
And so I was like, okay, what other jobs do writers have? And I was like, oh, like screenwriting. And I hadn't been allowed to watch TV or movies growing up, like at all. So I really didn't understand that someone wrote those things.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, NYU has a great program. If I'm going to go anywhere, I have to go to the best program, or else my parents are going to disown me because I'm like a very like ungrateful child. So I was like, I'll just get in there. And luckily, I did, and they gave me the most money. So my mom, while she did try to start World War III, could not kick me out of the house. And I went there, and I discovered that like when I was there, all the other women of color, and there weren't a lot of us, there were like three, they were all writing about like very heavy experiences. One was a refugee from Sierra Leone, and like she had gone through things that no one should ever have to go through. And another one was like writing very heavy hitting, like sexual, racial tension things. We were 17 years old, 17, 18.
Hmm.
And so I was like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be writing because that's what the women of color in this department write. And I
Hmm.
just want to fit in. I don't want everyone to know that I'm just a violin nerd who doesn't know anything about movies.
Hmm.
So I tried, and like I really sucked at it, like truly awful. Like at one point my friends rounded me up and they're like, hey, like you talk a lot of shit but you're not very good. And I was like, oh my God, I'm being
Called
found out.
out.
Exactly. So I was like, okay, fuck it, I'm gonna go back to my dorm room. I'm just gonna write something that makes me happy. And that's not something I had done in the course of my artistic life. I had never pursued art as a form of happiness, but always a form of discipline, um, and just an expression of like willpower. When you're playing classical music, you're not playing uh, your own, it's not your own story that you're telling.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
can put your own story into it through the musicality, but essentially, these are like old white dudes who have written this thing, usually for God, and you're like, I'm just here to show you that I'm technically perfect. So
Yeah,
like it
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
even occur to me that art could be used for an expression of who you were, which sounds super naive now, but like I didn't know. I just didn't know. And so I went home and I wrote like a Tarantino-esque thing with a body count of like 14 that ended with like 3 pages. And my professor was like, oh, this is what you write like? And I was like, yeah. And ever since then, the entire course of my career has been filled with like that kind of joy, of just happiness, of of writing things that are irreverent and violent, and that's kind of what I do now.
I love that because so often, a lot of creatives, their journey is sort of the opposite, where they start off very free form and just doing it for themselves, but they don't learn the technical part and like sort of the discipline of, okay, I need to practice, practice, practice. So that's kind of cool. At least you have that foundation of like, hunting down that technical proficiency. So then that reinforces that creativity. Speaking of creative work, I saw your short film, Passionata, and I incredibly appreciated the way you commented on race and gender by playing with our expectations of race. As a writer and a filmmaker of color, I would actually love to hear your analysis on, the current era of what a lot of people consider like woke cinema. There's obviously a plethora of movies out there like Moonlight and Gook that make a real attempt to discuss race and gender in a nuanced and meaningful way. And other times it feels like it's like woke capitalism and, executives trying to cash in on this culture. What's your take on this trend? And when do you think it crosses a line from being genuine to being shallow and pandering?
That's a tough one. So for instance, with Sundance, like one of the most revered institutions of independent filmmaking right now, they're all about diversity. But I've hit against a wall where I'm like, is this poverty porn? If I'm only telling stories about recidivism because I'm a Black man, but I'm actually from an upper middle class background, is this genuine at all? Or should I just be like, yes, we should take this because these stories need to be told? I personally come from the school of thought where representation matters so much more to me than pretty much anything else. So for me, the movies that I resonate with the most are martial arts films where it's a female protagonist. Like I watched The Villainess. It's a Korean movie that's fantastic. If you haven't watched it, you definitely should. And I was like, fuck yes. Why? Because yes, she's East Asian, but like it's a woman of color doing totally badass things in a space that is usually left for just white men. And for me to even begin to be like, oh my God, I kind of see myself in that, makes me feel like I can do anything, much more so than having stories about the immigrant experience being told to a white audience. I don't need to be told my own story. I want to see what's possible. I want to see that I'm not going to be living in this space of you're defined by where your parents came from, where you came from, and you're never going to go beyond that. And I'm so proud of my background, but when it comes to filmmaking, I think right now we're still pandering towards the white lens, and that doesn't interest me. And what I want to see more of is people just making movies and television from a place of this is what my world looks like, and this is what I want my world to look like. And once we enter that world of like fantasy and like craziness where like I used to teach film, and I was at the high school that I went to, and I started just because I was feeling jaded about the industry. And then all of a sudden I realized that the Black and brown girls in my class looked up to me in a way that I didn't think was possible. And I was like, I feel like I have a responsibility here because they think I'm so exceptional that just having a teacher is changing the course of what they think they can do. And I was like, I'm totally for that, but that's absolutely bullshit. I want to get to a place in filmmaking where those girls look at me and are be like, so the fuck what? Like, I can do that too.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I want. And I don't think filmmaking wise, content wise, we're even close to that. But I think that's the bar that we need to hit.
I love that because one of the discussions that I had a while back is like you were saying, these films that are all about representation and trying to convey, you know, the immigrant story and how we came here. And like, I totally get it, especially when you're talking about like second generation immigrants who like they don't feel like they've had films that told their story. And so, you know, we're starting to see that. But I even feel like, okay, there's some sort of, there's like a fatigue of like, okay, we like, not to say that, you know, we shouldn't hear these immigrant stories or anything like that. Like, of course they are all important. I would never say that like they shouldn't exist. But like you said, like there are other aspects of our lives and experiences that you can comment on. And I love movies that are just like, it can be about representation, but it could be more nuanced, and it could be about like different aspects and different types of personalities within that community, as opposed to just being like struggle porn.
Yeah.
Now, one of the coolest and, you know, sort of scariest things about filmmaking is just how potentially influential your work might be. On one hand, your film could be a force of good, like a documentary offering, you know, a new perspective for a marginalized community, or a children's film offering a, you know, positive representation. But on the other opposite end of the spectrum, there are films like, you know, Birth of a Nation from the early 1900s, which ignited massive outbursts of anti-blackness, or Breakfast at Tiffany's, a movie in the 60s that perpetuated xenophobia. Now that you have this power of filmmaking and storytelling, what specific stories do you want to tell? Whose stories do you want to tell, and what impact would you like to make with your films?
I want to tell the stories of my family. So I am not Black presenting, but my mother is Black.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I have a responsibility to include that in the narrative, because even if I'm writing stuff that is like Tarantino, if I write my version of Pulp Fiction, it's going to be so colorful and it's going to be nuanced. Like I wrote a feature film once, and like there's a Korean woman is getting married to a Filipino man, and the mom is being super racist. And so I went on a bunch of meetings about this, and it was racist in like a just like a microaggression kind of way, just like
Mm-hmm.
making those snide comments like
Mm-hmm.
you're like, what are you doing, these kinds of things. And it was funny, and it was in an action script. But when I went out to meetings, people were like, oh my god, that was like so crazy, like that people would she was just such a bitch. And I was like, dude, like this is life. And like it's very funny to you, and people think that uh like the voice that I have, like just the other day I had a meeting with a studio, and they said, and they meant this is completely a compliment, but they're like, hey, if your name wasn't in the byline, I would have never guessed that you wrote this, because it's so full of like testosterone, it's so masculine. And I was like, this is okay. It's like I can write like that too, but also what was he was really taken aback by was the voice, and the voice was just the voices of my family. The way that we talk to each other, the way that we yell, the way that there's like 18 different languages from different people. That's what my world looks like. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff I need to make, is just to show how wonderful the world is, and fucked up and weird and cool, but just through a lens of diversity. It's but like not diversity, I hate that word, because it's like not diversity for me. That's just my life.
So is it more just about like I sort of like to think of it as like a filling in of the gaps, like, you know, where representation could just be this blanketed like outlining of, oh hey, this community exists, but you know, for someone like you, like your job is to sort of fill in the nuanced details and sort of the stories that lie in between the crevices. Damn.
Exactly.
um
Dog's not happy.
Seriously.